There are moments in life that test your patience, and then there are moments when the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, Karen, shows up in broad daylight, struts across your driveway in her pearl-studded flip-flops, and shuts off your power with a smug grin while declaring, "That's what happens when you break the HOA's energy compliance code." I was still holding a carving knife over a half-sliced roast chicken when the lights went out, the ceiling fan died with a whimper, and every smart device in the house glitched into digital limbo. But I wasn't panicking. I just smiled and leaned against the doorway while she stood beside the transformer, her hands proudly on her hips like she'd just conquered Everest. I took a long breath and said, "Karen, you just disconnected the live test relay for the emergency solar grid, and I run the company that powers this entire neighborhood." Her face dropped like a crashed drone. It had started as a quiet Thursday evening. I'd been enjoying a calm dinner with my fiancée, Amanda, in the glow of our sustainably powered dining room. The wine was chilled to perfection, our lights dimmed just right, and the thermostat was holding at a cozy 72. I had built my home to be off-grid capable. Solar panels, backup batteries, even a water recycling system in the backyard. It wasn't just a hobby. I was testing the newest system design for BrightGrid, the renewable energy company I had co-founded. This neighborhood was the pilot site, with every fifth home wired into our tech under a contract with the city's Energy Sustainability Department. But despite the permits, the clean installation, and city support, there was one constant thorn in the photovoltaic garden: Karen from the HOA. Karen believed herself to be the moral compass of our gated community, wielding the HOA rulebook like a sacred text. She handed out fines like Halloween candy. She once wrote up a neighbor for hanging wind chimes too close to a common wall. For months, she had been fixated on my solar panels. "They don't match the aesthetic," she'd barked in one meeting. "They're too shiny." I had shown her the permits, the HOA waiver signed by the previous president, and even offered to host an informational session about solar safety. Her response was a letter demanding a $10,000 retroactive fine for unauthorized energy harvesting. I ignored it. I wasn't about to pay a fake fee to someone who thought daylight should be taxed. But this was new. Cutting my power, physically cutting it, was beyond outrageous. It was dangerous. I stood beside the open breaker box outside and looked at what she had done. She'd bypassed the HOA electrician entirely. There were bolt cutters on the ground, the lock to the relay panel was dangling in pieces, and the wire had been pulled out with zero regard for safety. Amanda appeared behind me, holding her phone up. "You getting this?" she whispered. The camera was recording. Karen, oblivious to the fact that we had her on video mid-vandalism, was still ranting about my alleged energy crimes. "This house has been bleeding energy back into the grid. It's illegal redistribution," she snapped. That's when our neighbor Vince walked up, rubbing his eyes like he hadn't had coffee in a week. "Karen, my baby monitor just went out. So did my fridge. What the hell did you do?" Karen blinked. "Excuse me, this is an HOA matter. Not for public discussion." Vince wasn't buying it. "I signed onto the BrightGrid test too. You just shut off my power, didn't you?" The realization hit Karen like a falling chandelier. She turned pale, then red, then a confused shade of peach. More neighbors started emerging from their homes. Some holding flashlights, others looking at flickering smartwatches and frozen garage doors. The entire row was dark. Only homes not enrolled in the solar pilot were still online, and ironically, most of them were rentals that Karen always said brought down property values. I pulled up the BrightGrid app and showed her the blinking red indicator labeled Relay 3, Emergency Shutdown. I didn't even have to speak. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Amanda flipped her phone and replayed the footage of Karen snipping the wires. A few neighbors gasped. One whispered, "She's so screwed." Karen straightened her spine and said, "This is HOA authority. I'm the president. I was within my rights." I smiled calmly. "Actually, you just violated 3 city codes and a federal energy pilot agreement. But don't worry. I'll let the authorities explain the rest. A truck rumbled into the cul-de-sac. It was a utility van with the city's energy partnership logo on the side. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand. "We got an alert that the grid relay in Sector 3 went offline," he called out. "Anyone know what happened?" Vince pointed straight at Karen. "She did it." The man blinked. "You cut a municipal test grid relay?" Karen fumbled for words. "It was unapproved. I was protecting the neighborhood." The technician wasn't amused. "Ma'am, you just disabled a power node servicing a third of this block. And this node feeds our disaster recovery pilot system. If this had happened during a real emergency, you'd be liable for endangering lives." Amanda whispered to me, "Should we call a lawyer?" I shook my head. "No need. She just sabotaged a city utility. This one's going straight up the chain." Karen suddenly wasn't so loud. She turned around and started fast walking toward her golf cart like nothing had happened. But every camera on every porch had already caught the moment. Every neighbor had seen the truth. And Karen had no idea what was coming next. I looked up at the darkened street, the faint flickers of candles in windows, and felt the silence settle. This wasn't just a blackout. This was the start of a full-blown reckoning. And the best part? I had designed the whole system with one very specific backup feature, something Karen would soon learn the hard way. Because when you're the one who built the grid, you don't just lose power. You decide who gets it. The next morning, our neighborhood woke to a different kind of alarm. Not the usual buzz of coffee makers or the hum of automatic sprinklers, but a confused silence broken only by the occasional slamming of car doors and the rising murmur of irritated voices. The outage that Karen had triggered by cutting the solar relay wasn't a simple flick of a switch. It was a domino fall. By 7 a.m., more than half the homes in the pilot grid had no power. I sat on my porch with a cup of instant coffee brewed over a backup camping stove, watching as neighbors emerged looking more disheveled by the second. Some were waving their phones in the air searching for signal. Others stared at blank security camera screens or fiddled helplessly with garage doors that refused to budge. Across the street, Vince was arguing with his wife about how to store their baby's milk before it spoiled. Their freezer had died overnight. Down the block, Mrs. Ellerby, a retired nurse who stored her medication in a climate-controlled cabinet, was shouting into a non-functioning landline. Even the streetlights, which were programmed to auto-dim based on solar sensor readings, had glitched and stayed at full brightness all night, irritating anyone who had tried to sleep with open curtains. The neighborhood wasn't just annoyed, it was teetering on chaos. Karen, however, seemed oblivious. She was up early, wearing her full HOA regalia, pink blazer, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard tucked under one arm. She had set up a folding table on the corner of her lawn, complete with a hand-painted sign that read Emergency HOA Briefing, Community Energy Crisis. A small Bluetooth speaker blasted patriotic music as she welcomed concerned residents with faux sympathy and wild misinformation. "The blackout is proof," she announced to a gathering of groggy neighbors, "that rogue solar experiments are endangering us all. We must immediately suspend all unlicensed systems and reassert HOA energy control." Someone near the back muttered, "What the hell is she talking about?" This was her fault. Karen didn't care. She basked in the spotlight like she was unveiling a new town monument. She waved a printed-out cease and desist letter she claimed was from the county. I leaned in and took a photo from across the street. The document was laughably fake. Comic Sans, incorrect seal, and the date was still listed as TBD. She had clearly typed it herself. But what made my jaw tighten wasn't the bad Photoshop. It was the fact that neighbors were scared. People were nodding along, unsure what to believe. In a situation where power was literally in flux, Karen was playing politics with electricity like it was monopoly money. I went back inside and opened the Bright Grid app on my laptop, which was running on a charged battery bank. I checked the real-time diagnostic. Relay 3 had been manually disabled, The logs clearly showed a hardware disconnection. I sent the data to our city contact and flagged it urgent. 10 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was Jake from the city's energy department. His voice was tight. "We just got the report. What happened over there?" I explained everything. Karen, the bolt cutters, the propaganda meeting on her lawn. Silence. Then Jake said, "Okay. That relay doesn't just feed your street. It's tied into a rolling test pattern for our rapid recovery grid. This could affect thousands if we don't stabilize it soon." He wasn't exaggerating. The Bright Grid pilot project wasn't just about individual homes. We were simulating how solar could be dynamically redistributed in the event of emergencies: storms, heat waves, wildfires. Karen hadn't just pulled the plug on a few homes. She had interrupted a municipal-level simulation scheduled to report to the State Energy Board next week. And worse, the outage had now jumped sectors, likely due to cascading power dips in neighboring relays. By 9:30 a.m., city engineers had arrived. This time, not in a quiet utility van. They brought 2 large trucks, a temporary command tent, and at least 6 technicians in bright yellow vests marked Municipal Energy Division. They began inspecting the node Karen had destroyed, setting up barriers, warning tape, and placing a sign in the grass that read, "Do not interfere, illegal zone." I smiled as Karen's folding table was swiftly relocated to the far edge of her lawn by a very polite but firm city officer. She protested, but her voice cracked. The crowd that had earlier gathered around her began to disperse, many shaking their heads. An hour later, a makeshift meeting was held in the driveway of one of the unaffected homes. The HOA board, which had been unusually silent until now, finally showed up. Karen, visibly rattled, tried to reassert herself by reading from a folder labeled Emergency Bylaws, but no one was listening. The board vice president, a mild-mannered dentist named Greg, cleared his throat and looked at me. "Can you explain to everyone exactly what Karen shut off?" he asked. I stepped forward and kept my voice even. "She severed a direct feed relay for the Bright Grid system. That relay supports smart load balancing and emergency redistribution during blackout. It also logs critical city-wide data for resilience testing. Last night, she didn't just cut power to a few homes. She endangered the integrity of a program meant to keep the entire district online during a crisis." Someone from the crowd asked, "Can it be fixed?" I nodded. "Yes, but it's not just plugging it back in. It has to be validated, recalibrated, and tested again by the engineers, which takes time. And we're losing that data window by the hour." Karen blurted, "You never had authorization to install that system in the first place." I held up my phone and scrolled to a digital copy of the signed city permit with her name listed among the approving signatures from when she was a board member 3 years ago. "Actually, you did. This document has your approval stamp." A murmur went through the crowd. Even the HOA board looked stunned. Greg leaned forward and asked quietly, "So this really is all her fault?" She was warned. And she did it anyway. Karen turned beet red and tried to pivot. "Well, maybe the system failed because it wasn't safe to begin with." A soft voice piped up from the crowd. It was Mrs. Ellerby, still in her robe. "Karen, if you hadn't touched it, my insulin would still be cold." Silence fell. Karen looked like she wanted the earth to open and swallow her. But it didn't. She just stood there, shrinking in place, as the realization settled over everyone that her power play had backfired spectacularly. The engineers continued working. The HOA board retreated to their cars, and I walked back to my porch, sipping the last of my lukewarm coffee. The storm wasn't over yet, but the skies were clearing, and I knew exactly what came next. Karen had poked the grid. Now it was time for the grid to respond. By midday, the neighborhood had taken on a strange silence, not the peaceful kind but the tense, watching kind. Power was still out in several homes, and the cul-de-sac was filled with engineers weaving orange extension cables around cones, inspecting power nodes and comparing tablet readings. Meanwhile, Karen had retreated into her house, blinds drawn like she was under siege. But she wasn't hiding out of fear. She was plotting. That much I could tell just by the way she peeked through the window whenever someone walked past her lawn. I knew Karen well enough to understand she wouldn't go down without a dramatic flail. The only problem for her was that I had already planned for this kind of meddling. When we designed the bright grid system, we had to account for both technical risks and human ones. People unplugging equipment, tampering with fuses, or trying to correct systems they didn't understand. So, I had set up an off-site backup node that mirrored Relay 3's operations in real time. Not only did it have a physical redundancy system, but it was also wired with a camera feed, data logs, and tamper alerts. The moment Karen yanked the wires from the main node, that backup had flagged the event and triggered a data vault that stored all inputs for forensic review. It wasn't just a failsafe, it was proof. Digital, visual, and irrefutable. I forwarded the complete log package to Jake from the city's energy department and copied it to the HOA board's legal counsel, the city compliance officer, and just for good measure, the local news tip line. I didn't expect them to run the story right away, but I knew they would dig into it once they smelled the HOA scandal. Especially with a nickname like Solar Sabotage Karen attached. It wasn't petty. It was public interest. People had the right to know how close their community came to being in real danger because one person decided she knew better. Around 2 p.m., the HOA vice president, Greg, knocked on my door. He looked sheepish and frustrated. "Hey, do you mind if I see that footage again?" I invited him inside and replayed the video Amanda had captured. Karen clearly cutting the wires, declaring herself the energy ethics officer, and ranting about rogue solar redistribution like she was dismantling a Cold War spy ring. Greg let out a slow exhale. That's not great. Look, we're probably going to have to do a special session vote. If we don't, the city's going to do it for us. Amanda walked in just in time to hear that. "About time," she said, tossing a folder on the table. "This is a printout of every complaint Karen filed against us in the past 6 months. 14 of them were about the solar panels. 6 of those contradict each other." Greg flipped through the stack, his face sagging more with each page. "Honestly, I think she's been holding a grudge ever since she lost the Lawn of the Month vote to you." "She doesn't even mow her lawn," Amanda snapped. Greg looked up, dead serious. "She bought a robotic mower and named it Sir Grass-a-Lot. She threatened to sue us when it got stuck in her flower bed." I couldn't help laughing, but the humor faded quickly. This wasn't just HOA drama anymore. It was legal territory. We'd crossed into real liability when Karen cut live infrastructure. I pulled up the footage from the night before, the one from the surveillance cam on the backup node. Karen, dressed in black, slipping through my side gate at midnight, flashlight in hand. The camera caught her inspecting the inverter cabinet before jerking on the main wire and triggering a spark. She jumped back, screamed something profane, and stumbled into the bushes before scrambling away. Greg stared at the screen. "Wait, she came back again after everything yesterday?" I nodded. "Twice, actually. We have a motion alert log from 1:17 a.m. too. She didn't touch anything that time, just stood and stared at the unit for about 5 minutes, mumbling. "Okay, she's lost it," Greg said flatly. "She needs to be removed." "That's your call," I said, "but you should probably act quickly. Once the city files their incident report, this whole thing's going to escalate. And the HOA might not just be dealing with angry residents. You could be liable for enabling her." Greg left looking 10 years older than when he arrived. Amanda and I sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked, "Do you think she's going to try again?" "Not tonight," I said. "Not after what happens next." An hour later, the engineers successfully re-established power through the backup node, restoring electricity to most homes within the pilot system. The residents began emerging again, relieved but still cautious. I sent out a short message via the BrightGrid network dashboard, letting everyone know the issue was being resolved, and that an update would follow from the city by evening. Responses flooded in: gratitude, confusion, a few angry notes blaming Karen directly. One reply, though, caught my eye. It was from a board member named Lisa. "We're scheduling a vote for emergency removal. Thank you for the documentation. Please stay available for a statement if needed." Karen didn't attend the next HOA meeting, but her shadow loomed large. As a compromise, they moved the session outdoors to the community park so more neighbors could participate. A folding table, microphone, and a portable projector displayed snippets of footage. People gasped, murmured, and some straight up laughed when Karen's voice rang out through the speakers declaring herself supreme enforcer of energy law. The board reviewed the evidence, then opened the floor to commentary. That's when it got ugly. Vince took the mic. "My daughter's baby formula spoiled. We had to rush to the next town over to buy more before her next feeding. That's not an inconvenience. That's dangerous." Mrs. Ellerby, with her walker, said, "My insulin almost cooked in my fridge. I'm 73. This isn't a game." Even Greg, speaking as VP, said, "It's not about panels. It's about someone thinking they're above the law, above safety, and above basic decency." At the end of the session, the vote was taken. It wasn't even close. Karen was stripped of her title as HOA president, prohibited from making or enforcing any community decisions, and banned from approaching any neighborhood infrastructure under threat of a formal restraining order. Word was that she watched the entire meeting from her upstairs window. But that wasn't the end. Late that evening, just as the streetlights finally flickered back to normal, a spark shot out from behind Karen's garage. I heard the bang from my front yard. Amanda and I ran toward the source just in time to see smoke curling from the back corner of her house. Her personal generator, the one she'd bought as a statement against solar dependency, had overloaded. Turns out, she'd tried to wire it into her main breaker without knowing how grounding worked. The fire department arrived within minutes, alerted, ironically, by the very same solar-powered emergency node she had sabotaged. I watched as they hosed down the blackened edge of her garage, listened to her yelling about faulty products and municipal conspiracies, and realized something. Karen had just lost more than control. She had lost the plot. The next morning dawned quiet, with an eerie sort of calm hanging over the neighborhood like fog before a storm. You could feel it in the air. The kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, but anticipation. Everyone was watching. Watching Karen's house, watching the HOA board, watching me. The community had been turned upside down in the span of 48 hours, and though power had been restored and the engineers were packing up their temporary operations tent, no one believed for a second that the drama was over. Especially not me. Because I knew Karen. And I knew she would never simply accept defeat. Not without a last, spectacular act of delusion. It came just after noon, when a handful of residents gathered on the grassy park strip at the center of the cul-de-sac. Greg had called for an informal demonstration at my request, and I had brought along my tablet, a small mobile inverter unit, and a confidence Karen couldn't shake with 1,000 cease and desist letters. As I set up, more people arrived, forming a loose semicircle, including the mayor's assistant, a few city engineers still on site, and a guy with a handheld camera who introduced himself as a freelance journalist. The HOA board was present too, minus Karen. "Let me show you something," I said once the crowd had settled. I tapped a few buttons on the tablet, and the small inverter sparked to life. Behind me, a makeshift light post flickered on, powered entirely by the rig I'd set up. This neighborhood is part of a scalable solar grid. With the flick of a switch, I can isolate houses, redirect power, and even keep emergency services online independently of the main grid. Someone asked if the system could survive a total blackout. I smiled. It already has. Twice. I showed them the live power routing map, the incident logs, and even a feature that allowed real-time reallocation based on emergency prioritization. Everyone watched, fascinated. They weren't engineers. They were parents, teachers, and retirees, but they understood one thing clearly. This wasn't some rogue experiment. It was a smarter future. Then Karen appeared. She came marching down the sidewalk with a megaphone in one hand and a roll of laminated documents in the other. Her hair was a windblown mess, and she was wearing a glittery sash that read HOA Honorary Emeritus, a title she'd clearly awarded herself. Her expression was equal parts rage and desperation. Before anyone could stop her, she started barking into the megaphone. "Attention residents! This man is conducting an unsanctioned energy demonstration on public property. I demand he cease immediately and submit all devices for HOA inspection." No one moved. The only sound was the soft whir of the inverter behind me. "Karen," Greg said, stepping forward, "you were removed from the board." She ignored him. "This is a hostile energy takeover. This is a cult. You're letting him install solar tyranny. Do you even know where your electricity is coming from anymore?" I turned the inverter off, just to give everyone a moment of silence. Then I stepped up to Karen with the calmest voice I could manage. "Karen, the only hostile takeover here is you trying to control people's homes, people's lights, and their right to a reliable power supply." She flinched, then turned to the crowd. "He's trying to privatize the sun. He wants to charge you for sunlight." A few people laughed. Someone from the back muttered, "Honestly, I'd rather pay him than go through another HOA blackout." But Karen wasn't done. She stormed back to her house and emerged 15 minutes later with a pair of gloves, a set of screwdrivers, and a folding ladder. I watched from the corner as she set the ladder against her house and climbed up to the side panel where her personal breaker was housed. Amanda nudged me. "Is she really going to?" "She's absolutely going to," I said, already pulling out my phone to record. With a dramatic flourish, Karen yanked open the breaker panel, muttered something about being energy independent, and flipped every switch off. Then she began pulling wires out of the box like she was defusing a cartoon bomb. Sparks flew, and she shrieked, falling backward onto the grass. She scrambled to her feet, hair frizzed, eyes wide, and shouted to no one in particular, "There! I have officially seceded from the rogue solar state." The moment would have been slapstick if it weren't so dangerous. Minutes later, her generator sputtered to life in the back of her garage. We all knew what came next. But this time, it wasn't a fire. It was a surge. She hadn't disconnected the feed properly, and when the generator kicked on, it sent a reverse pulse into her system, frying her kitchen appliances and triggering her home's internal smoke alarms. She came running out of the house, waving her arms as the alarm blared behind her, and shouted, "This is sabotage! You rigged my wires!" The fire department returned. Same truck, same crew, same tired expressions. They walked up to me first and asked, "Same address?" I nodded. "Same homeowner?" I nodded again. "Same problem?" "Worse," I said. "Now she thinks she's energy sovereign." As they checked her house and disabled the generator, Karen sat on her lawn chair holding her honorary sash and muttering about conspiracies. One of the firefighters whispered to the other, "That's the third visit this week. Does she get a punch card?" I stood next to the mayor's assistant, who had witnessed the entire thing. She turned to me and said, "We'd like to talk about expanding the solar pilot. Officially. And maybe putting safeguards in place to prevent HOA interference." "That," I said, "is the best news I've heard all week." Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the inverter lights cast golden beams across the grass, I walked over to Karen's place. I didn't knock. I just left a small solar-powered garden light on her porch, shaped like a sun, with a little tag that read, "Let there be light, the legal kind." Amanda and I walked home hand in hand. The neighborhood was lit again, not just by electricity but by clarity. People had seen the truth with their own eyes. They had seen the greed, the overreach, the sheer ridiculousness of someone who believed control was more important than community. And they had chosen common sense. Karen had finally been unplugged, for real this time. The following week brought a kind of peace that hadn't existed in our neighborhood for years. It was subtle at first, garage doors opening without issue, porch lights glowing in synchronized amber warmth, kids on electric scooters zipping across sidewalks without their batteries dying mid-ride. The bright grid system had been fully restored and recalibrated, this time with full municipal oversight and a clear clause written into the HOA bylaws. No member, not even a president, could interfere with community infrastructure without city approval. That line had Karen's fingerprints all over it, and everyone knew it. What they didn't know, not yet at least, was just how far the fallout from her little power play would reach. The city's final report arrived with the quiet gravity of a courtroom verdict. They concluded that Karen's interference had disrupted a critical pilot project, caused measurable losses in collected data, compromised neighborhood safety, and exposed the city to potential liability. The phrase, reckless sabotage of a public energy initiative, was used not once but 3 times in the document. It was also noted that had the incident occurred during a fire or medical emergency, the result could have been catastrophic. That alone was enough to trigger a cascade of legal consequences. Karen was served papers within 48 hours. Civil negligence, code violation, unauthorized tampering with public utilities, and just for good measure, a cease and desist from the city attorney preventing her from setting foot within 30 feet of any relay, transformer, or solar unit tied to the grid. It wasn't jail time, but it was enough to strip her of every ounce of perceived power she'd ever clung to. No clipboard, no HOA meeting access, no votes, no voice. The HOA board, now under new leadership, wasted no time issuing a formal apology to the neighborhood for the incident. Greg, the newly elected president, came to my door personally with a hand-signed statement of thanks and an offer to waive the next year of HOA dues for all residents involved in the Bright Grid pilot. I told him I didn't care about the dues. What mattered was that people had learned something. That community wasn't built on control. It was built on trust. And Karen had detonated whatever trust she'd once had. What happened next was something out of a local legend. News of the incident had trickled its way into regional papers, then picked up traction online. The phrase, HOA Karen cuts power, gets burned by solar genius, made its rounds in meme culture. A clip of Karen declaring, "He's privatizing the sun," became an instant classic. But it was a local news story that finally brought the icing on the cake. A crew arrived one morning and asked if they could interview me in front of the original relay Karen had cut. I agreed. They framed the segment as a community spotlight titled, From Blackout to Breakthrough, The Solar Rebellion. Amanda and I watched it that night while sharing popcorn. My favorite moment was when they cut to Karen's house. Lights off, curtains shut, and a for sale sign jammed crookedly into the front yard. Apparently, Karen had decided to move. No announcement, no goodbye. Just a U-Haul and a trail of complaints about ungrateful neighbors and overreaching municipal thugs. No one threw a party, but I did notice more than one neighbor raising a silent glass from their porch as the truck pulled away. It was poetic. The queen of the HOA had abdicated under public scrutiny, and the kingdom had never looked brighter. I decided to do something symbolic, something permanent. In the spirit of closure, I designed a small sculpture, a sunburst made from copper solar strips, mounted on a recycled steel pole, and planted it at the entrance to the neighborhood. Underneath it was a plaque with a motion sensor that lit up a message whenever someone walked by. Let there be light. Let there be reason. It was subtle, tasteful, and unmistakably aimed at Karen's legacy. The HOA approved it unanimously. But I wasn't done. The city, impressed by how the community had come together and how resilient the solar system had proven even under attack, offered Bright Grid a contract extension to expand the test area into surrounding neighborhood. They also granted us special designation as a certified municipal infrastructure partner, which meant we now had the legal protections and resources previously reserved for traditional utilities. I was invited to speak at a regional energy conference where I presented a case study titled, "The Human Variable: Designing Tech for the Inevitable Karen." It was a hit. Amanda and I were walking home from that conference one evening when we noticed something new. Our neighborhood was glowing, not just in a functional sense but in a literal, aesthetic way. People had embraced the solar tech. Homes now sported rooftop panel arrays in sleek designs, garden lights powered by mini-cells, even mailbox sensors that ran on solar trickle charge. The place looked like a brochure for a smart village. The same street where Karen had once marched with her megaphone was now lined with clean energy and quiet confidence. Then one night, I got a call from Greg. "Hey," he said, "some of us are putting together a little gift. For everything you did. Just a thank you. Mind coming down to the park tomorrow at noon?" I said sure. And when I showed up, they were all there. Neighbors, friends, city engineers, even a couple folks from the mayor's office. Greg stood up on a small platform and gave a short speech. Nothing flashy. Just a heartfelt thank you and acknowledgement of how one person's stubbornness had sparked a wave of progress they hadn't even known they needed. Then he stepped aside and pulled a cloth off what looked like a wooden sign. It was bolted into the lawn, and burned into the grain were the words, "In brightness we trust, dedicated to the neighbor who gave us back the light." I didn't say anything, just nodded, throat tight, and looked around at the faces in the crowd. Faces that had once been skeptical, annoyed, even divided. Now they were just grateful. That night, as Amanda and I sat under our backyard solar lanterns, she nudged me. "You know, I almost miss Karen a little." I turned to her, surprised. "Seriously?" She grinned. "Just a tiny bit. After all, she gave you a story. And us? She gave us a neighborhood worth living in." I smiled back, raised a glass to the sky, and whispered, to Karen, "May her next HOA be far, far away from any breaker boxes." The lights flickered on cue. And they never flickered off again.